Welcome, everyone. And of course, as always, we'll start with a bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Hey.
Amen.
Rabbi, can I ask a question about the Nazir? Because I don't think we're going to get to that.
Sure can. No, we're not likely to get to it. Please, go ahead.
Can you please explain the conundrum of the minimum period of the Nazir is 30 days.
Yes.
If a Nazir is in the presence of some, I'm not sure if it's also something, but someone who dies suddenly, so his Nazirot is invalidated and he has to shave and bring a sacrifice and start over again from the period. But if he loses a mother, a father, a sister, a brother, he's not allowed to observe, respect that. I'm a little, can you say something about this?
All right. So again, I will give a caveat at the beginning. I do not claim expertise, right, in all the details of Naziriteship. This is what I'm thinking. I've puzzled to myself exactly what is the nature of becoming a Nazir. And it seems to me, because there are similarities between what the high priest had to do and was prohibited from doing on some levels. The high priest wasn't forbidden to drink wine or anything like that, whereas a Nazirite is. But on the other hand, you know that the high priest was not permitted to mourn for any deceased relative. The high priest. Another thing too is that when the Nazirite finally completes his term of Naziriteship, he shaves his hair and completely. And likewise, when the Levites were dedicated, they had to shave their hair completely. So there are similarities, and it seemed to me that the Nazirite becoming a Nazirite was in a way an attempt to gain a level of holiness similar to a high priest. That a normal Israelite can never become a priest, right? You can't become a priest, a Kohen. You have to be born into it. But nevertheless, if a person was so motivated to take on all these various strictures, all these various details and prohibitions, they could attain that kind of level of holiness. And that's why this answers your question as to why the Nazirite could not mourn for his anyone at all. And I'm happy to, go into any other element that you want to ask about as far as that is concerned. I can tell you that the rabbis puzzled a little bit about, why the fact that it's phrased like that someone should die suddenly in the presence of a Nazirite, because that you might think that if the Torah wanted to discuss that halacha, they simply would have said, if a Nazirite comes into the presence of a corpse, right? If he comes into the presence of Avi Avot HaTumah, the highest level of impurity, he cancels out his Naziriteship. Why did it say happens to him petach pitom? Why just, suddenly out of the blue this happened? And that sort of led them to analyze a little bit the possible motivations for someone becoming a Nazirite. Because even though on the surface, becoming a Nazirite appears to be a great act of personal self-sacrifice and devotion, sometimes those motivations, as we know, that people who become religious, or if we become a little bit more observant, we can look down on other people. And so they say that the reason this happened to this person was a divine punishment. I hate using that term, but a divine consequence, because this person was doing it to feel arrogant, that there was an arrogant streak to why this person was becoming a Nazirite. The Nazirite, of course, had to allow his hair or her hair to grow indefinitely. They weren't allowed to cut it. And in some ways that can be a source of beauty and vanity, and that might have been a reason why this person was doing it. They actually go explicitly into some of the reasons, negative reasons, why this person might have wanted to become a Nazirite, which is why God had this happen to them. So just alongside a little more information than you asked for, but that's part of the discussion of this whole portion in the Torah. So it's a great lesson in terms of, what motivates us to want to become more observant.
So females could be Nazirites?
Yes, I believe so. I believe so. Yes.
According to what I read, yes.
Yeah, I don't think it was limited to men. So, yeah. All right. Should we go back to the text? Jocelyn, you have any follow-up questions, or does anybody have a follow-up question at this point?
I'm just still mystified that, part of observing the, mourning period or death, for a parent, it's like, wow, this Nazirite thing, it supersedes honor thy father and thy mother, which is commandment.
True. Well, with the high priest, when they describe the fact that, and we can analyze that a little bit, right? That the people used to come up to the high priest if he lost a relative for whom he would normally be obligated to mourn for, to observe the mourning customs, and they would say, your mourning is upon us.
Oh.
So they would try and comfort the high priest in that way. So here's the thing. Does it stop him from grieving for them, for his parents? No, it's not saying you can't grieve for your parents. It's just that you cannot observe the mourning rites. And of course, some of those mourning rites involve the fact that you're absolved from positive mitzvahs, before the person is buried. And I've tried to think about why the Torah would mandate this. And in some ways, I think you could look at it as trying to reinforce the idea that the grief we feel is, and the tragedy of it isn't so much that they've died, because as far as we're concerned, they have moved into a new existence, a new kind of existence. But what we are really grieving for and trying to express in those mourning rites is being able to work through grief at the loss. So this person is prevented from doing the kinds of things that can be comforting to people in a process of loss. And if you'll allow me to share an experience that I had. So when I first became a rabbi early on in my career, and it was my second pulpit, and without going into lots of details, I was much more concerned about minutiae than perhaps I am now. But one of the things that was not common in those days was covering the casket. It has become very common nowadays for people to participate in covering the casket. But 40 years ago or 30 years ago, it was not a common practice. People said, you're throwing dirt on the person. They'd use terms like that, and they'd feel it was disrespectful. And trying to wean people from that attitude and understanding that was not the case was much more of a challenge back then. And I remember going to a funeral. It was the parent of a rather prominent person in my congregation in Canton, Ohio. And in Canton, in that part of America, the ground is very clayey. There's a lot of clay in the ground, and when you when you put the earth on the casket, it makes a lot of noise. And so, of course, this was just adding to it. And I'd asked him to do it, and they were willing to do it. They did it. And of course, there are a bunch of people. You can feel the sort of feelings of anger and whatever going on in the group. And afterwards, I spoke to him, and he, after the funeral, and he said to me, Rabbi, he said, I wish people understood and knew how comforting it was for me to be able to do that.
Mm.
So I still remember the thud of clay on my brother's casket in the middle of winter.
Of course.
It's very clay. Yeah, it's very thuddy. It's not. Yeah, you don't forget that sound.
Yeah.
I was wondering, could the Nazirite choose to mourn for his or her parents?
Okay, so Again, specifically, I believe it had to do with observing mourning customs and exactly which customs. So for sure, he would not be allowed to go into a cemetery, just like a Kohen. So this sort of, again, leads me to believe that this is sort of a very interesting piece of Torah law, to sort of accommodate people who, because of yichus, because of status, could never become priests, but on some kind of level could share in the nature of the holiness of a priest.
What's it like to be a priest?
Well, that's right. But I mean,
Pretty much.
but they're doing it for a good reason. Okay.
Right.
I mean, hopefully they're doing it for a worthwhile reason. So to specifically answer your question, I cannot do that. But I think that that's basically the way it's stated in the Torah. It appears that we are talking about any, halachic issues when it comes to mourning. But you can't stop a person from grieving, right? And in some ways, what I was saying before is adding to their grief, so that it's not disrespectful, of their parents or of the person who's their relative. But, a Kohen, as you know, cannot walk into a cemetery. So they would not be able to walk into the cemetery, at least as best as I can understand, because a cemetery is a place where there are people who are deceased, and therefore it's a place of tumah.
I think it's, I could be wrong because I have no idea, but I think that it may be related to the fact that if you're a priest, or if you're completely dedicating yourself to God's work, then you're, supposed to be sort of more spiritually involved and understand that the person who has died is now, being judged by God, and hopefully having, eternal communion with God.
Mm-hmm.
But if not, it was still what God deemed to be the right thing to do. And so that person would have, at least symbolically, and with some kind of at least on an intellectual level, have some kind of understanding of that as something, more celebratory, and not something to engage in, like stop doing mitzvot, maybe even steep them up, and again, I agree with you. It doesn't mean that psychologically they're not feeling things and they're not mourning, but that they have some kind of evolution. And I also do think that it's sometimes possible psychologically for certain people who are extremely evolved spiritually, or even psychologically, to sort of rejoice in what others might see as a tragedy, because of a belief, in the rightness of what happens, whether it's, because God made it happen, or because it is reality, that's something to see as for instance, as something to learn from, and that's always a joyous thought.
I agree.
And so, I know that sounds strange, but it's not my first time dealing with the subject matter, and I think that there are people that's a thing. It's just not easy for most of us.
Right. Lauren, I agree with you. I actually, those are the lines in which I'm thinking as well. So, I mean, you spelled it out more than I did, but that's exactly the point. Yes, that you can recognize that this person has perhaps moved into a place which is far more blissful than the world we live in now. And there's plenty of evidence, both within source material and living life itself. We recognize both the grandeur and the pain of being alive. And hopefully, as we believe in God deeper and deeper and deeper, we see the beauty of it all and the necessity of it all. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to repeat what you said. I think you said it very well, and I happen to agree with you. Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
You bet. Jocelyn, thank you for asking the question, for posing the question. Okay, so remember, we were discussing the issue of the camp having now been set up. that that were on three different levels of spiritual impurity were sort of quarantined out of the various camps. So again, as you sort of learn the details and eventually and try to sort of process them and sort of take a look back, from a larger view to see what exactly is going on, what kinds of feelings do these things engender, in what way do they develop a person's consciousness and things like that, what they're conscious of. I think that's all part of this. And the effect individuals can have perhaps on a community. So at any rate, we read, Vayasu chen b'nei Israel, that in fact the children of Israel did it. And there's a little bit of ironic humor I always feel when it says this, because when it says this, to me, it is sort of connoting the fact that they might have done this with a certain initial reserve, but nevertheless overcame whatever feelings they had that were counter to doing this mitzvah. And this is being said about them as a deep compliment, saying that they overcame what their natural feelings might have been, and that there's sort of an element of surprise here, that it's not, at least in my own experience, as limited as it is, I recognize to what degree people resist, doing what the Torah tells them to do. It's first of all out of ignorance, because they're not that interested in finding out what the Torah has to tell them. And secondly, out of stubbornness, that we all have this innate stubbornness. And so this is a deep compliment here to say that the children of Israel, in fact, did it. They didn't murmur, they didn't argue, they didn't, they did it. Vayishalchu otam, and so they sent them out, el michutz lamachaneh, from outside the camp. And of course, having read Rashi, we are now sort of understanding exactly what this meant. We would have, if we had not read the Rashi, we would have had a totally different, not totally, but a very different meaning to what this meant. Ka'asher diber, and here's the thing, it goes on to say, Ka'asher diber Hashem el Moshe, just as Hashem had told Moses. And it repeats it. Look at this. It emphasizes this. Kain asu. Thus they did. It's already told them they did it, but it tells us again, B'nai Yisrael. So in some ways, I'm thinking to myself, is this also telling us that this wasn't an easy mitzvah for them to perform, but they still did it. They overcame whatever feelings they had, and they did what they did. New subject. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. So Hashem spoke to Moses, saying. So there's some interesting mitzvahs that are found in this parsha. Daber el bnei Israel, speak to the children of Israel. Ish or isha, a man or a woman, ki asu michol chatot ha'adam, who transgress any of the chatot, the sins that a human being can sin. So there may be this is an interesting thing when it says mikol chatot adam, because as Rashi and obviously based on what the rabbis are saying, is that possibly here chatot adam is suggesting when one sins against one's fellow human being. In other words, as opposed to divine, things that involve divine service. Nim'ol ma'al bashem. And look at this. So if chatot adam means this, at the same time, it means to commit a trespass against Hashem. And I think that's, if where I'm coming from is correct, to understand that when we wrong a fellow human being, we are automatically committing a trespass against our Creator. V'ashma ha'nefesh. And I think Rashi is going to explain what this means, but it means, and that's that soul, Ashma, incurs guilt. And I believe what the implication of that is, that you recognize that what you did was wrong. That, because sometimes a chet refers to an unwitting sin, a sin out of ignorance. And certainly there are times when we'll wrong another person totally unintentionally. But at this point, this is recognized. I'm going to go on a little bit, even though there's a Rashi on this, because I think just, becoming a little more familiar with the Torah text is good. Vehitvadu et chatatam. This is the important thing. Vehitvadu means they shall confess et chatatam, the chet, the sin, the transgression, let's call it that, asher asu, which they committed. And this is the important thing. Vehitvadu, they shall make confession. Veheshiv et ashamor berusho. This is, as Rashi will tell us, the new thing that this Torah portion is telling us. And it means, and they shall return his guilt, berosho, the principal. So this is now talking about some form of theft. So you have to return the theft, or obviously if it's fungible, the value of the theft, the chamishito, and 1/5 Yosef alav, he shall add to it. So there is now a penalty added. Not only do you have to right the wrong that you committed, but you have to pay a penalty for having committed the wrong to begin with. And I need to explain something very important. I may have explained this before, but I want to explain it again. That when it says 1/5, it means 1/5 of the complete amount. In other words, it actually works out to be a quarter. So it's not just 1/5 of the original amount. It actually turns out to be a quarter of the original amount, which turns out to be 1/5 of that amount plus the 1/5. So that's how much. And that applies, as far as I can tell from all that I've studied, across the board, that whenever it talks about 1/5, it means 1/5 of the total amount, that after you've added it, it should be 1/5. So essentially it means 1/4. V'natan, and he shall give it, la'asher asham lo, to the one against whom he is guilty. In other words, the one from whom he sold. So there's a lot of actually very interesting laws here. I'll go further, because there's another little piece here that's important to know. Ve'im ein la'ish go'el. So the Torah goes on to tell us that if this person whom he robbed or stole from is no longer around, no longer living, right? And it's saying if this person against whom he stole does not have a redeemer, meaning a next of kin, okay, lahashiv hasham elav, because we understand that he is not just, the person who's committed the theft hasn't just sinned against that individual, he sinned against his family. There's this whole idea that is counterintuitive to Western thinking. But so understandably, the law would be that if you stole something from somebody and that somebody passed on, you would owe it to their heirs. You would need to give it to their heirs. But if this person does not have a redeemer, lahashiv hasham elav, to whom to return the guilty, the property that you stole. Okay, ha'asham, this piece of property, that for which he is guilty, hamushav lado shem lakohen, has to be given to the kohen. So it is, which is returned to Hashem, shall go to the priest. And then it goes on to say, milvad el hakipurim, aside from the ram of atonement. So remember, if you've sinned against God, you now also have to, if you've wronged your fellow human being, you've sinned against God, and certainly in a case of theft, you have to, not only you're going to pay an added 1/5 as its meaning, but you also have to bring an offering, asher yichaper bo alav, upon which he will be atoned. So Rashi tells us that this is actually coming to teach us a couple of new ideas. And essentially let's say it ashamo berosho, right? It's his guilt at its principle. And he refers to the Talmud here, Baba Kama.
Rabbi, are you not going to go back to the other two Rashis?
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me go up there. Forgive me. Lim ol mal b'Hashem. Thank you, Lauren. Hare Chazar. Okay, so here we go. Hare Chazar v'katav kan Parshat Gozel, right? He says this: the Torah goes back and writes down here the Parsha, the section regarding theft, v'nishba al sheker, or someone who swore falsely. That is, swore falsely concerning a deposit that was made, that someone gave him, and said, I returned it, or he never lent it to me, or something like that, or I gave some of it back. He just, I gave it back, and he only gave part of it back. Anyway, all those sorts of situations. He Hamorah Parshat Vayikra, which is referenced in Parsha Vayikra. So if you remember that back in the first Parsha of Leviticus, when it was discussing sin offerings, it went through a whole bunch of different circumstances for which a sin offering is mandated. Right, let's go on now. Uma'ala ma'al Bashem, right? Committed a trespass against Hashem. And here we go. This is in Vayikra chapter 5, and it says, that if he committed a trespass against Hashem and he dealt falsely with his fellow, right? It's Vegomer, etc. V'nishneit kan, and it's taught a second time here, bishvil shnei dvarim shenitchatshu va, because there are two novella, meaning two new ideas, two new elements of law that are going to be mentioned here. Ha'echad, right? The first new element is shekatuv v'hitvadu, that it states that he shall make confession. Lomar, to tell you, she'eino chayav chomesh v'asham, that he is not obligated to bring the 1/5, the added fifth, and the guilt offering, the ram that was mentioned, al pi edim, that even though there are witnesses who can testify regarding his crime, bishvil shnei dvarim, sorry, al pi edim, ad sheyodeh, until he confesses, badavar, in the matter. So those additional things, interestingly enough, are seen as ways in which to atone. So rather looking at that added fifth and bringing the ram offering as punishments, we should recognize them as being opportunities to totally cleanse himself from the sin he committed. And that's how we are being asked to look at this. V'hasheni, and the second element is, on the new thing, al gezel hager, which refers to somebody stole from a proselyte. Shahu nitan la kohanim. Now Rashi is using shorthand here because what it's saying is, I'll have to explain, all right? That it's referring to, so in other words, that if you stole something from a proselyte, from a convert, and the convert died so that you can't return it to the convert, you give it to the priests. Okay, let me explain this. You need to understand the entire circumstance. We are talking about a situation where a convert doesn't have heirs, right? I mean, essentially, back then, the way they understood conversion, and especially if you look back at how Ruth expresses her desire to Naomi to attach to her, that essentially they cut themselves off from their family. So that's why there were no heirs in that case. But if the convert married, right, got married and had children, and therefore had heirs, of course, this would be returned to them. And he had died, they would have to give the theft and all these other things to the convert's children. So if there was a case where this person who had converted, this proselyte, had no heirs, then it would be given to the Kohanim. The theft, it wasn't like this person now could get away with it. The person who committed the theft could get away with it because there were no heirs to give it to. So that's the thing. So we will have to stop here because it's 8 o'clock. I'm going to stop the share and just take a moment to take any questions that you might have and try to see if I can answer them quickly. All right. The music is playing. All right. So let me wish you all Shabbat Shalom, and I will stop the stop the recording and hope you found this of interest.